My name is Chris Pierce. I have been here for about 18 years as a design teacher. Created this thing called the AA Visiting School, which works all around the world, which is where the story of Armenia comes in. And I'm going to be super brief because you're not here to listen to me. Aram and I taught a unit here for many years together. And we were always working in Scandinavia, and he could not get me out of Scandinavia. So finally he said, Chris, I've had enough of the unit. I'm going to Armenia, which is fantastic news because he's done some extraordinary things there in just a short period of time. There are two people I have to thank before I stop talking. One is the British Council, who generously funded a part of this project this past summer in Armenia, and the Armenian Institute for just constant support, communication, and everything else behind this work. Erica, as a representative of the Armenian Institute, I'm going to hand over to you and then let you pass over and introduce them.
Thank you so much, Chris. Welcome, everyone, and get settled in if you're coming in. So it's very nice to see so many friendly faces here, and welcome to the panel discussion Building Culture in Armenia. So if you don't know the Armenian Institute, we are a cultural center, a library and an archive that aims to foster dialogue and connection between the UK, Armenia, and the worldwide Armenian diaspora. So tonight brings together 4 professionals, creatives, working with communities in Armenia to develop sustainable craft and construction. So we'll have 3 short presentations of their work, and then we'll have a short discussion, and after this we'll go upstairs to see the exhibition and have a drink and continue the conversation. So I'm just going to introduce very briefly, everyone to leave time for their talks. So Guillaume Othenin-Girard here is an architect and an academic coming from the Department of Architecture at the University of Hong Kong. He is the co-founder of a cooperative called Architecture Land Initiative that works closely with political actors and NGOs to enact sustainable and equitable transformations of landscapes, public spaces, and architecture. Welcome. Then we have Nairi Khatchadourian, who is an art historian and curator, currently based in Armenia. She will probably tell us more about her work and the curatorial practice that she founded, called the AHA Collective. She works with contemporary artists within urban and rural settings to revitalise local heritage. Amongst many other achievements, she is the co-curator of the Armenian Pavilion at the upcoming 2025 International Design Biennale in Saint-Étienne, France. Then we have architects Aram, Mooradian, and Shant, Charoian. They work with architecture students to identify and protect heritage in the face of growing development and mass tourism. So Shant here is an architect, a Harvard graduate. He's based in Armenia, and he's at the initiative of many very interesting projects, among which the Line Armenian Architecture Biennial, and of course the Oshakan project, which alongside Aram, which you will hear more about in a minute. Aram Mooradian is the director of Mooradian Studio, a London-based architectural practice specializing in sustainable projects. He is, as you heard, an alumnus of the AA and he used to teach here as well. He is the director of studies in architecture at Downing College in Cambridge, and he conducts many educational initiatives, such as the Oshakan project. We are very proud to say that he's also a member of the Armenian Institute's board. So you'll learn more about the Oshakan project in the talk. It was an architectural summer school in Armenia that took place last summer. But you will also learn about it by visiting the photography exhibition that is on right now and for the next 3 weeks in this very building. So this exhibition upstairs and tonight's panel are part of and are actually the closing events of a mini festival of architecture entitled Living, Building Together that the Armenian Institute has organized to kind of go together with the Oshakan project. And it was funded by the British Council, whom we thank. Lastly, I'd like to encourage you all to visit the Armenian Institute's website and discover more about our various projects and events. We are actually able to continue our mission thanks to your generous donations. So please consider making one through our Support Us page, through the Become a Friend button. Thank you very much to everyone. And now over to you, Aram.
Thank you very much, Erica, and also Chris, for that introduction. I guess I have some of my own very quick thank yous to make, just so that we can get to the talk. But I would, first of all, like to thank Bedo and Arda Egian, who are here, because they encouraged me to go to Armenia for the first time, and gave me a magnificent tour and really opened up a world that's really informed, I think, a lot of my architecture and my teaching since then. I think also the Armenian Institute is an incredible organization, and the AA as well, both very intellectually curious and open-minded organizations. And also the British Council. I think this whole project began because the British Council in Armenia gave us a little bit of money to subsidize some students from the UK to go to Armenia on our summer school program, but also to allow us to involve local Armenian students in the program as well. And I think that was, incredibly beneficial for the dynamic of the course. That was followed by another grant from the British Council in the UK, where they said, well, why don't you show some of this work in London and bring it back? And that's how today came about. We began by bringing back some of the work, speaking to some friends who were photographers and getting them to contribute some photographs of the village where we've been working. So you can see some of that on display upstairs. So afterwards, when there's a reception, you can go up and have a look. But it also meant that we could invite some other people who are doing really interesting things in Armenia, I think, to come to London and share some of their work. So, you've already had introductions about Nairi and Guillaume, and I'm looking forward to their presentations. I think it's a really exciting moment in Armenia right now. There's a huge amount of initiative that's really growing and blossoming, and it's a nice opportunity to share that. Anyway, I thought perhaps I could start with this image. Some of you, I hope most of you know approximately where Armenia is, but I thought I'd give a very quick introduction. This is a photograph that I love. It's actually of a caravanserai, which I think Guillaume is going to talk about a little bit later. Up in the top of the mountains in Armenia. And what this really exhibits is how this country is at this kind of geopolitical crossroads between the Middle East, Russia, Anatolia, and various places. So when I was first started thinking about doing a summer school in Armenia, I went to a talk at the horticultural school at Kew. And there was a student who had been given a grant to travel, and she chose Armenia, I'm not sure why. And she went to this caravanserai and documented all the different plants that were growing around it. And it was incredible because this little microclimate was supporting plants from as far away as China, from Europe, from Africa, from all over the world. So this building somehow represents, I think, how Armenian architecture and culture has come about through these incredible links that spread all around the world. So obviously, I think I put some slides just in case you haven't seen Armenia's iconic churches. It was very, adopted Christianity very early on and was one of the first Christian countries, and it's famous for these kind of incredible, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century churches, which I think what you'll realize is a lot of them feel like they're still alive. These aren't these aren't sort of static artifacts spread across Armenia. They're very much maintained as structures that kind of continue, that have part of a cultural continuum. Obviously, here's some geography. People ask me all the time where Armenia is, so this is why I'm boring you with this quickly. But I think what's particularly interesting here, you can really see how it's at this border. It's important to know that the Armenian people inhabited this region in the east of Anatolia, predominantly, and the border between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire was approximately here. So after the Armenian genocide, most of these people spread around, went to Syria, went to France, went to the US, and speak a dialect of Armenian that's developed within the Ottoman Empire. And the country that is today is the half that didn't experience the genocide in the same way and was part of the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union. So there is an interesting dynamic which might come up in discussions today between a kind of Armenian diaspora who spread around the world and how they interact with the country of Armenia. I mean, for me, as a diasporan, it's a bit like coming from Cornwall and going to Scotland to get in touch with your roots, but just to give you a kind of idea. So I thought I'd locate within Armenia some of our projects. We have Shant and I working in Oshakan, which is a village just outside Yerevan, the capital. We've got Guillaume working in the Vedi River Valley, just south of that, and Nairi doing projects in the east over the current border in Azerbaijan and within Armenia. So perhaps we can move on to the Oshakan project. So what we've done is, because we have this kind of photography exhibition upstairs, I thought what might be a nice way of structuring the talk is through a series of photographs from the first year of our visiting school. So just to give you a quick idea of how we decided to structure it, we wanted to have half local Armenian students, half international students. Ended up being slightly fewer Armenian students because of funding. This first year was really a chance for us to get to know the place, to create connections, embed ourselves within the community. And we didn't want to kind of helicopter in a kind of creative program. We wanted to kind of grow a program over a series of years and really see how that developed. I think Shant can continue with the beginning of the program.
Hello. So what we're looking at here is actually the first instance of the summer school, and I think it's a very symbolic moment because we kind of just gave the students a name of an architect, of a person, and a statue. We were like, meet us at the statue of this student, of this person, and I think it was also a very important moment for us because it's the statue of Alexander Tamanyan, who is kind of the father of Armenian architecture in some ways, especially in the context of Yerevan. So he was the architect behind the planning of Yerevan and the Yerevan we know today, because what you're looking at now just barely existed before the 1920s. So Armenia joins the Soviet Union, and suddenly, like, an architect has a bright idea of like how we can reimagine the city, and he introduces this garden city inspired from many European cities, and it kind of becomes this 15-minute city center where everything becomes very close to each other and everything becomes interconnected. But a lot of the main issues that come out in Yerevan right now is the fact that the city is growing and booming. There's a huge housing boom right now and construction boom. And the way the city is planning is taking this boom is actually quite sad, because it kind of uses the original plan of the city to kind of destruct some neighborhoods from the city that are like extremely old parts of the city. One of them is Firdus, the other one is Northern Avenue, but at the same time there's a sprawling effect happening, and
the master plan wasn't complete in the 1920s, so there have been in recent years initiatives to try to complete the master plan, which has had certain destructive consequences.
Yeah. And one of the ways that they handle this situation is quite sad, because Armenia has laws about protection of heritage, and the way they protect these heritage doesn't necessarily actually allow them to stay. It becomes a form of facade retention that kind of just keeps the skin of the building and allows for the whole complete back to be gutted and basically just plastic surgery or something. And
when they were building Northern Avenue, there was this idea, which was an avenue they built that was part of the original master plan, this idea that they would number all the buildings and put them back together somewhere else. But nobody really knows what happened to all of those numbered blocks of stone.
And here you're seeing the building before and after they basically gutted it. And these are pictures that I've taken throughout my time in Armenia and Firdus. But yeah, what we're looking at here is the city center that we were talking about. But we were also looking at how the city was growing and where it was growing towards. And one of the main issues we have is that it's just so chaotically growing, and it's just for the sake of making money, that it's creating spaces that are just not habitable anymore. And while we were looking, at the same time, we were also thinking, like, how can we do a summer school in Armenia, and where do we situate a summer school? And here we're seeing one circle, which is the center of Yerevan, but there's actually another circle that I want to highlight, which is up here. And that is the hill of Oshakan.
Yeah, I think we looked at various places, and I think logistically we decided it's important to start with the students in Yerevan and have access to its shops for materials and things like this, and tours and all sorts of things. So we knew we had to be close to Yerevan, and we visited various places, and then we encountered Oshakan, and it's really like an onion, and it's just all these concentric rings of different kinds of heritage. Most tourists, I think, tend to go south of Yerevan on day trips to Garni and Gerhard, or they go east to the lake in Lake Sevan. But this area, Armenians might drive through Oshakan because it has the burial place of the man who invented the Armenian alphabet, Mesrop Mashtots, which is in a sort of church here somewhere. Where is it? Can't quite identify. So they'll just drive through this town and then keep going, or get out the car, take a look, and then keep going. But when you actually walk around, what you realize is there's this incredible mound above the whole town with a little chapel on top of it, and there's this incredible gorge, the Kasar River Gorge, which I'll show you some photographs of. So here you can see the gorge along the side of the village, and Mount Ararat just over the border in Turkey. What's interesting about Didikon, the hill in the center of the village, is that it has views of all three of the main, important mountains to Armenia: Mount Ararat, Mount Ara, and Aragats. And here you can see this gorge. So most people don't really see this part of it. You have to go behind the houses and turn a corner, and then suddenly this huge landscape opens up. And at the top of Didikon, it's quite fascinating. There's actually a 3,000-year-old Mooradian fortress, which after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was only really semi-excavated. So there are actually 5 different palace complexes that have been identified around the site, most of which have not been excavated at all. There was a local museum which closed in the 1970s, which had lots of artifacts in it, but they were all shipped off to a big museum in Yerevan. And I think at some point the museum building was sold off to private owners, like many things in Armenia. So here you can see, this is one of Piruza's Khalapian's photographs, which you can see upstairs. This is of some of the stones of the Mooradian fortress. We kind of began our research trying to find material and archive material. Here you can see before the Soviet tin roofs were added to all of these buildings. we decided, well, we have to go to archives in Yerevan and see what we can find out. We went to the National Photographic Archive, and they made us wait a very long time to access their material. And they came out with maybe 3-4 photographs on these little postcards. It was this incredible moment where Shant and I were sitting with the director, this very Armenian scene, sitting with the director of the photographic archive who was interviewing us, I think. And at some point he saw me fidgeting with my bottle of water as I was becoming impatient, and he said, "Would you like a cup?" So I was like, "Sure." So he hands me a little paper cup, and I pour my water in it, and then he hands one to Shant, and he puts one in front of himself. He opens the slide drawer, pulls out a bottle of cognac, opens it, fills Shant's glass, fills his glass, looks at me, and in Armenian says, "When you learn Armenian, you can have some cognac." So it's quite. He had sort of portraits of the Soviet leaders up on his wall with the sort of great Armenian writers and things like this. So, the language is very important, I think. So this is another photograph. You know, we didn't really have anything about Oshakan from this place, but what they did have is lots of amazing photographs of a nearby village, Burakan, which is home to an astrophysical observatory, and it's incredible. These are some cosmic ray stations attached to the observatory further up the mountain. And it's an incredible set piece and constellation of buildings by Sambel Safarian, who's a brilliant architect. We can tell you a little bit about that later. And then here's actually a photograph of the culture house in Oshakan.
Yeah. So the image we're looking at right now is an image from the archive, one of the few that we actually could use. And what we're seeing is people using this culture house. And this culture house is a building designed by Curator Nairi, and it was built in 1957, and it's one of the series of many culture houses across Armenia that was built during the Soviet Union. I think Nairi is going to talk about one of them later. But yeah, it becomes a space where art and culture is actually accessed by many, many people across the country. And what we saw through this picture was that maybe we could actually go and visit this culture house and see what we can get out of it. And this culture house actually became a gateway. Well, we first, as architects, we admired the building, obviously. I mean, it was like really gorgeous, very classical. And as a son of Alexander Tamanyan, Curator Tamanyan, he like managed to build something that was so utopian in a way by thinking about like how stairs could be used by the students during the evening. And currently, it's used for movie screenings once a week, but also just giving access to many of these urban things within the village. But also another gateway for us was actually seeing that there is a full-on community that just can do anything that goes from arts to ceramics to dance to music to even like European ambassadors club of Oshakan exists through this culture house. But for Aram and I think that this image was really important because that day that we visited the culture house was actually the day we met this woman. Her name is Digin Kohar, and she is one of the many amazing women that actually work in the culture house and really care about the village. And I think we finally started to understand what Oshakan was when we met her, because through her we could hear all these stories, and it wasn't just about the gorge and the beauty of the landscape around it, but it was really about the people. And she took us on a walking tour, even though she was like, what's the word for it?
Yeah,
struggling to walk. Like it was difficult for her to walk, but she really wanted to show the village to us. So she took us to places that we hadn't been to, and one of which is this beautiful staircase.
She was telling us stories about how, so this gorge is riddled with cave churches and chapels and all sorts of kind of places of local importance. And she described the sort of vision that one of her relatives had to build this pathway to allow people to access one of these caves. It's quite interesting because a lot of them were actually pre-Christian sites, which were sort of absorbed into Christianity. So these places have been visited for a really, really, really long time, and you really feel that when you're here. And there's a gorge which sort of brings life to the region with all this flowing water. It's very spiritually charged, I think, somehow, through all of the kind of monasteries that are built alongside it and all of these caves and stuff like that. So yeah, it was quite interesting. And I think at that point we realized that there were all sorts of local, this is the inside, you can see how locals kind of maintain all these little shrines and things like that. And you're really climbing along the edge of this gorge to get to these places. So there are all these kind of local narratives, sort of stories, and there's a lot of importance to these places, many of which are not documented. And I think that was kind of interesting to us. Here you can see a chapel that was built very high up, and they've now built this kind of slightly ugly staircase to get you to it, but perched on the side of this gorge. This is the main bridge that spans the gorge in Oshakan. It's one of the only crossing points of the Kasai River, I think, built in 1706. It's quite interesting, actually. It's unusual because it has 5 different bays, but it sits at a point of the riverbed where it's very wide and quite spacious.
Well, yeah, this medieval, not medieval, 1700s, built in the 1700s, it's connecting the village from one side to the other. At the same time, it's spanning in such a wide way because the river is so wide that it's impossible to span it in any other way. But what's sadly been happening is that slowly this riverfront and its beauty is being exploited. And here we can see that 15 years ago, this was just this is the bridge here. And then here, suddenly, the main portion of the bridge is being taken over by local swimming pool. That kind of just completely ruins the
aspect, right?
Yeah, the whole vision of the nature and.
So a lot of the riverbed is being privatized for recreational sites.
It starts with this, and then it goes on to barbecue huts along the river that people can rent out. And but other than these problematic development projects that are happening in the village, it's also becomes kind of like a haven for artists. And here we're looking at the home of Sveta Matuni, some colleague of mine that I met through some programs, and she is a ceramicist, and this is her home. And I think you can kind of imagine that between people's properties, everyone had their own garden and everyone had their own orchard, and kind of created a haven. I think when our students were there with us, oh my God, Holly. When our students were there with us, we were seeing fruits being dried up in the sun so they could eat it in the winter, and it's just maintained this down-to-earth lifestyle that people obviously don't have in London, but yeah. And then it kind of also provoked our imagination about how the village is between people's homes, and and these are images that you could visit upstairs in the exhibition.
This is a photograph I like. I took it looking out of the culture house in Oshakan, and you can actually see in the distance the astrophysical observatory, because we were trying to think of a place for the students to stay that was big enough for everybody to stay together. So I'll just digress a little bit to talk about Burikan. So here's Oshakan, here's the Didikon with the gorge, and just a 5-10 minute drive away is Burikan with the observatory. So Stalin built this in, I think, 53, something like that. There was a famous Armenian astrophysicist called Viktor Hambratsumyan who won a big prize. And Stalin said to him, well, okay, what do you want? You can have a gift. And he said, well, I want an observatory in Armenia. So he built this incredible international observatory with people would visit from all over the world. It had its own schools, its own post office, and Stalin arranged for trees from all over the world to be brought to Oshakan and to be planted in an arboretum and a garden. It had conference centers and they would host international conferences. It's an extraordinary place. And dreaming of having our students work here, we actually called them up and they said, yes, we can stay. So you can see today it's full of these beautiful gardens. They're very informal, actually. It's an incredible place to work where we'd sit with the students. And this is the Sunbelt Savarian Soviet-era guest house that we stayed in.
And basically, the whole complex is a series of buildings. What we're looking at here is the 2.3 meter wide telescope, which was one of the largest telescopes that was built at the time. But luckily, we kind of managed to make it our home, which was really, really nice. And alongside it, there's also the Orgov radio-optical telescope, which was like this big hole in the ground.
So I think, and what we realized is that, to really uncover information and to understand how to build in this place, we had to really invest a lot more time with the people who are living there to understand what was there and what the values of heritage were. And a two-dimensional map is not necessarily the best way to capture all those different types of heritage value in a place, but it was a starting point for us, I think. Some of the teaching I'd done with Ingrid Schroeder at Cambridge was very much about engaging in field work in specific places and how you embed yourself in order to develop an understanding as an architect.
So our goal was, the first thing we did was, okay, we're going to do a map. We want to do a map and we want to collect the community stories. And what we did was we managed to invite a few people from the village to join our students right after a talk that Nairi gave to our students. And it became this very interesting first step into the village because it kind of allowed for everyone to understand different aspects of the village, kind of multiple narratives that could come up through the village, but also could also see what things the students were interested in researching and surveying within the village. And yeah, it became this like really messy, collaborative piece that is actually upstairs again. But something that kind of is currently the only place you can actually get any of this information about Oshakan is this map, which we're really excited about and we thought was the perfect way to start. So what we're looking at as well now is the Manganot's church, or Saint Zion. And I reached out to the local university and we decided, okay, how do we get the students to survey pieces? We thought, okay, maybe they should learn old school surveying techniques. And we had a great workshop by Manushak Titanian, who is a preservation architect based in Yerevan now, but she used to be based in Artsakh. And she taught the students how to survey without any surveying technology, basically, like bare bones surveying techniques to just measure elevations and basically using a transparent tube with water. And yeah, it became a gateway for students to survey their own things and research their own topics.
Yes, I thought this was an interesting archival photograph that we came across of Manganot's. Before it was refurbished recently, you can really see that they just added this hat on top of it to complete it. Yeah, you can see the new stone. It's really quite, and it was also adapted in the 10th century as well, and originally built in the 4th or 5th century. So it has all these kind of different layers, which I think the students were quite interested in. It has an incredible surface to it. Sundials, mason marks, crosses carved into the surfaces of the stone. And what's interesting is all the different stones that comprise it are all different sizes because they would just take it from the quarry in whatever size it was and trim it on site. So here we have Simon Pietro and Maria, who decided to survey the kind of old and new elements, kind of document the kind of different layers of this structure. So they came up with a kind of paper casting technique and produced these kind of paper molds of the kind of junctions between the old and new layers of this building, trying to unpick it. And immediately adjacent to that is this kind of what's colloquially was referred to as an obelisk. And it was kind of strange, unlabeled thing sitting there. And we kept asking people what it was, and we kept getting different stories and different explanations. And I thought that kind of multiple parallel narratives to the meanings of things was quite interesting, and something that we tried to document throughout the kind of program, and to kind of raise awareness with the students that there isn't always one correct history to something. So, I mean, it was actually originally found inside one of the local houses before it was moved to this site. And you can see here a kind of photograph from the 19th century where there's a stork has actually planted a nest on top of this kind of strange obelisk.
And then, which leads us to the storks, and basically just close your eyes and imagine this village, and then at the same time, imagine these storks living above the village all throughout, and it becomes a thing you're just constantly seeing and connecting to. And visually, the village is just with layers of these storks, and the stork nests are so wide, and then they're only held up by these electricity posts. And as Aram likes to say, these storks travel all the way from Tanzania and end up in Armenia.
In this village.
In the village of Oshakan. And the interesting thing is that they actually came to the village like 40 years ago. And before they were more near the Khorvirab region. And slowly they started to come to Oshakan with the weather patterns changing. But they've become part of the village and community. But we had a student, Lachlan, who was extremely interested in these storks and kind of how they were part of the village. And what we're looking at now is actually the bottom of the post, and the post is not touching the ground, so the wooden post is attached to a concrete post with like a metal wire, and this is something you're seeing all throughout the village. And at the top it's the stork, and he produced a one-to-one drawing of how big the storks are alongside how long the post is, which was this I think it really brought to perspective how big these things are and how much of the village they are. And you can also see this piece upstairs, part of the piece upstairs.
So this is another one of Perusa's photographs of the interior of an abandoned factory, which still has all of the machines in it. And students were very curious about it. They were talking to some of the people in the local culture house, and a lot of the women in the village, this was the kind of opportunity working in this factory to escape their kind of traditional family lives. So they talked very wistfully about it. You know, the students took some of these artifacts, surveyed the space, you know, kind of created a kind of record of that role that this factory had. And what's quite interesting about the factory is the owners now have moved to Moscow, so it's just sitting there. And that's a very prevalent issue in these kind of places. A lot of these abandoned and semi-abandoned houses are owned by Armenians who've moved elsewhere or relocated. And often it's very difficult to find out who actually owns a lot of these properties. So this kind of this ruinous quality to a lot of the buildings that aren't maintained is partly because of this. So this is Hong Yi, photographed next to a building that he was surveying.
Well, to wrap up our year, our first year in Oshakan, we also ended it with a big celebration in a very Armenian way of gathering and showing, displaying the work, and kind of ended it on like this happy note of showing the work of the students. And it was really interesting because it kind of turned this culture house that's full of kids to kind of like a semi-contemporary art gallery. And it was a way for people to just see what we'd done for the past 2 weeks in Oshakan and celebrate in a way, and which was the reason why we even got to do this exhibition upstairs because of how happy we were with the turnout from the first year. And it became an archive of Oshakan itself. Even though it's currently sitting in my basement, it's still an archive of Oshakan that exists somewhere in Armenia. And it was a celebration.
Right. And so there's a question really about what next. This first year was really just about getting to know the place. One thing we noticed in conversations with the students about how we should continue this was that although there's this kind of economy of means to everything, the exhibition, we didn't have tables, so we had to put everything on the floor and create kind of spaces and things like that. There's an absolute incredible abundance of stone. Here you see a 19th century church where they've kind of got this spolia of old artifacts. There's a huge amount of knowledge in Armenia about how to deal with this material, and it's very available. There's lots of incredible experimentation in the Soviet eras about how to use waste materials and things like that. So I think for us, as we move into construction, experimenting with the most abundant thing is exciting for us. And I thought the week after we finished the summer school, there was an international competition to rebuild the central market in Gyumri, which is a city north of Oshakan, or northwest. And it was destroyed in the earthquake in the 1980s. So Lawrence in the studio and I decided, we just got back from Armenia. We thought, okay, they've extended the deadline 2 weeks, we'll do it. So a lot of this kind of idea about looking at what's local, looking at what's available in the economy of means, we thought, well, why don't we just use stone? The existing market collapsed because it was actually built out of concrete and just faced with stone, but stone, there are ways of building that you can allow movement. And labor is very cheap. So we put together a scheme where we'd introduce a large food garden for a culinary school, which we're designing with Mark-Emil Hermansen from Noma. So this idea of a kind of food garden that you can walk into and engage with, and orchards with varying degrees of publicness in it, and a large central food market for the city to rebuild it. And it'll all be kind of different experiments across the whole site with stone construction. So I guess it's just wanted to include that, these kind of ideas and how they kind of inform our own practice, I think.
And another thing we wanted to end on was actually like this painting by Yeranu Aslamanian, because you're seeing a painting from the 70s that was showing how stone became one of the main, tooth stone here, it became one of the main materials of Armenia that was industrialized.
Yeah, it's interesting, it's often cheaper than concrete in Armenia. So.
And here, I think we have someone. Izzy, can you stand up? Can you? You stand. So here, you guys are looking at our truck driver next year. So we decided that next year we're gonna rent a truck and go around the city to collect materials to figure out how we go forward with building next year.
So that's it. So yeah, we'll see what happens. Benny, thank you. We're over.
Hello everyone, my name is Guillaume. Thank you, Shant, Aram, for the talk and the journey, but also thank you for the invitation, also to the Armenian Institute and the AA. I'm actually very happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, actually. So I'm going to share my current research project that I'm conducting at the University of Hong Kong in partnership with anthropologists and archaeologists in Armenia. The project in itself has various temporalities and quite different from what you've just shown, because we've been working on this since almost 3 years now. And it all started with that man here on the photograph, Dr. Peter Cobb. He's an archaeologist, Anatolian specialist, and he's excavating the Vedi River Valley fortress, which is that big monolithic piece of geology that you see here. And well, it's a defensive apparatus, geological apparatus, but it's been used as a fortified ground since the late Bronze Age, and had then quite an intense medieval period. And Peter knew by my previous work, it's not the first time I work with archaeologists and look at the cross-disciplinary potentials between the two worlds somehow. And I'm not going to enter too much the archaeological complexities of the site. It's sufficient to know that, it was a very important defending spot which framed the valley, and was also situated on important trade routes between the Sevan Plateau and the Ararat Plain. But I want to actually talk more about the role, our role as architects, actually involving such an archaeological dig, which often spans over decades. And basically, we're interested in the living and how the living surrounding the deep past actually accommodate or enters in conflict or tensions with it, and basically how to kind of create a form of interpretive strategy that use the momentum brought by the archaeologists to kind of rethink that idea of heritage within the valley and the local communities. So we are also interested in the geology of it and working with geological experts, but really it's more to situate archaeological actions or excavations as one form of dwelling among others, or one sort of taskscapes. And so we started to look at the valley as opposed to the fortress itself. Trying to understand how it came to be as it is now. We're 1,000 meter high, so quite high, and it's a semi-arid desert climate, and you can see very clearly the line of demarcation between the green belt and the semi-arid desert. It's a volcanic land, obviously, because we're just facing Mount Ararat. And one of the most urgent, let's say, issue that the valley is facing is that according to scientific estimate, by 2100 there will be 77% less water in the valley. So it means that for agricultural valley production, it's pretty drastic. And what does it mean somehow to excavate a deep past if the living is itself somehow endangered? So therefore the act of digging or excavating became more than just an archaeological endeavor, but a sort of promise to understand or analyze also the soil and the richness of the soil, but also the ecologies that inhabit that place, and somehow battle for their future preservation. This is the valley. On the left-hand side, you can see the fortress in red, the big circle, and on is the red dot. Yeah. And then here is the Khosrow Forest Reserve, which is actually one of the oldest natural reserve in the world, created originally as a hunting ground by King Khosrow, and it hosts the most incredible endemic and traveled fauna and flora species. And so this valley is really a sort of outpost to that natural reserve. And there's in the middle a little dot, which is the village of Urtsadzor and the headquarters of the archaeological excavation, which is strategically positioned between the different embranchments of the valley. So we started to map quite intensively and draw, create this transscalar type of drawing, very long drawing, which are somehow cartographic instrument. We call them federative drawings because it's the possibility to compress various horizons of times together, but also they become the recipient of our findings coming from archival materials, map or GIS, but first and foremost actually from intense field work, interviews, conversations, with the local communities and experts. And we draw, one of the challenge actually was to find data. So we quickly realized we had to create our own set of data. And following the rigor of the archaeologists, we started to draw directly in GIS, so QGIS, so geolocalized form of data, so that it also becomes available to everyone afterwards. But it was somehow a way to situate the fortress and the archaeological activities together with the other potentials, sometimes dormant potential or affordances that are in the valley, and try to create or design some form of synergies between them. And somehow also question this idea of heritage itself, because we found very interesting spots which are somehow dormant, like abandoned mining quarries, and this is a travertine quarry, or small chapels hidden in the Khosrow Valley. It was also a way to understand ways of making in terms of material flow, construction materials, it's really rural. And there are these little islands or pockets of green ecologies that are quite fantastic, thanks to the Vedi River, actually, which gave the name to the whole valley. And we slowly started to identify key moments, or we call them figures, which actually orient an understanding of frame moments in the valley according to specific topics. So on the left, for example, is erupting, mining, excavating, and on the right-hand side, with Urtsazor, is more about flooding and farming. They're building actually a massive dam on top of it. They're almost done. It's not filled yet, but it will have quite drastic consequences on the valley itself. Some villages will have access to water, some actually will be deprived of water. But it's really to understand landscape as a form of cultural assemblage of interiors and exteriors. And then we started to create this workshop or collective forums with the municipalities, with students, and also local stakeholders, inhabitants, to share the production of our research. And if we met them in the first phase more individually, this was also an opportunity to bring very different opinion in the same room, or for example rangers and hunters, or disguised hunters. So it's also the possibility to actually give a safe space for potential tensions or divergence in terms of the future of the valley. And following this process, we started to identify seeds of projects or actions or initiatives that could be taking place in the territory. We call them proto-project. It's actually linked to the Cooperative Architecture Land Initiative. There's a bridge here in terms of research. And they range from punctual infrastructural interventions such as bridges, benches, to larger schemes like repairing roads or creating new water channels, information center. There's even the possibility of an agro-archaeological center, which I would be very keen to push actually. It also involves accommodation, so identifying the different families that are willing to host visitors, tourists, because we're also running summer electives, so the whole demography shifts completely for 2 months in the whole valley, because you have students coming from all over to excavate in the archaeological campaign, or being part of the surveying and design build initiatives that we trigger. We also involve, there's also larger territorial projects such as mapping new hiking routes. And I'm just going to talk about 3. And the first one is an intangible one, but a very important one, is we created a foundation. So the Ararat Plain Southeast Archaeological Project Foundation. And it really is an important tool because it allowed us to very pragmatically to actually seek for fundings that are also outside of the academic sphere, but also establish a juridic entity for the whole project, and also a tool for the communities to pitch projects and use that vehicle to potentially gather the funding to realize this proto-project. And we also had access to a plot for the foundation. And one of the first things that in Urtazor, in the village, so the closest village to that natural protected reserve of Khosrow forest. And the first thing we did is actually we walked the whole site with Mariam Ahababian, a dear friend and fantastic botanist who specialized in the South Caucasian region, and she's also one of the consultants for the rangers, and she really kind of guided us through this whole realm of plant and species. We collected a lot of seeds because one of her idea is to basically transform that plot as a rock garden and basically become an embassy or an outpost of that natural reserves, where we would be able to kind of maintain some endemic species as well as rare species, and somehow create a form of medium ground between the community of the village and the rangers. So one of the big problems is water. So we started to map the natural irrigation flow of the plot and try to kind of rethink what sort of channel apparatus we could create. The first thing we did was to create a reservoir, because the water doesn't flow every day. Sometimes it's every 2-3 days. So the most important thing is actually to store some of the water. And we worked with this concrete geotextile, very thin, 5 millimeter thick, to create. I mean, it was part of a summer elective, so we made quite a few prototypes, and it was designed and built by the students on the spot within these 2 weeks, and worked with also a prototype for channeling the water in. Another important project is the archaeological field lab, which in a way serves to store all of the artifacts found, but also digitize them and analyze them, restore some of it, and it also function as a community space, and it's active for archaeologists 3 months a year, but the rest of the time the idea is that some of the teachers from the valley could use it as well as a classroom. And Peter is really pushing forward the digitizations of archaeology, which means collecting an immense amount of data, digitizing it, and then training a form of AI to piece it back together, and then use augmented reality to have the possibility to be on site while excavating and having access to the spatial recording of its trenches, because archaeology destroyed its evidence while you dig. So the structure of the lab is, the floor plan is actually super simple. It's almost like a train with wagons, because one of the most important things was not to mix any form of fluxus. So it starts with washing, drying, labeling, weighting, scanning, analyzing, and ultimately storing. It's half subterranean. You can see that it's actually half dig into the ground, and it talks about that idea. One of the things that we were interested in was the landscape implementation. So it's half subterranean, and it's highly inspired by the glkhatun, the head house, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. But for those of you who are not yet familiar with it, it's a semi-buried monocameral dwelling, which date back to 3,000 years ago and spans all the way up until the Sovietization of Armenia. And what fascinates me is what happens when all these individual dwellings start to collide with one another and recreate a new form of geomorphology. And you have the Yerdik, the central oculus, in the center of the Hazarashan dome. The dome is a Hazarashan dome, quote unquote, is made out of 1,000 pieces. And what fascinated us was, in one hand, the implementation and the geometry of the dome, of course, but also its thermic capacity, because it resisted quite brilliantly in winter to store heat, because you have a hearth in the middle, the tonir, And in summer, it's fresh because you have all these layers of soil and straw and grass on top of it. And today, most of the glkhatun in present-day Armenia are not very much in good shapes because in the 90s, following the dark and cold years, a lot of the heritage that was made out of wood was burned in order to survive the energy crisis and pass on the winter. But it's an amazing typology because it spans across Anatolia, so present-day Turkey and Georgia, and a bit in the north of Iran, Azerbaijan, and always kind of stem from these Armenian communities. And so what does it mean to actually build the glkhatun today, or touch upon this idea of the glkhatun, because we're not really doing a glkhatun, but somehow trying to transpose some of the elements. And we decided to, one of our goals was to minimize as much as possible the use of concrete for sustainable reason, but also budget reason. And one of the issues in Armenia is that the primary materials are very hard to get. The timber comes from Russia. Armenia lost a lot of its timber reserves to present-day Turkey because all the glkhatun before were made with forest that was actually part of Western Armenia, a substantial amount of it. So we wanted to use basalt timber with the ones that we could find and kind of revisit that dome and think more in terms of flexible structured earth retention system for the walls and the roof as opposed to a rigid and solid one. So one of the challenges was also to kind of not fight, but battle with Soviet standards in terms of engineering, and also to start to think in terms of composite structure as opposed to monoidic structures made out of all of concrete. And so we started to build this mock-up and prototype with workers from the valleys and from the community. We used basalt as a primary structural element. This is one part of the wall, actually, retaining wall that we're trying to test. Basalt, as we saw in Aram and Shant's presentation, is present pretty much everywhere. I mean, it's a volcanic rock, and it's a volcanic land. So there's a profusion of it. But recently in contemporary architectural production, it's often more used as cladding. And what we wanted to do here was really to kind of restore its or reinforce this idea of structural element, which is a bit difficult in terms of seismic regulations, but it's getting there. And we hacked also the concrete geotextile to establish a form of roofing folding system for the roof before the layers of clay and earth. It's all work in progress, so we don't have the earth yet. Obviously wanted to build with the people of the valley and the local community, and so we created this manual, this step-by-step manual to convey our ideas, but also to kind of ping-pong with them in terms of their own ways of making. One of the important thing is that there's no vocational school in terms of construction workers in Armenia since the fall of the Soviet Union. So part of that project is also a sort of initiative to train, to some extent, new ideas, or develop new ideas and then train the people that could build it and could then possess that know-how. We are now actually in the process of building the retaining wall with the concrete canvas. And we were actually totally amazed by the basalt stone cutter, because it seems a bit bricolage like that, but he was so precise and came up with this monolithic block of basalt that we could pile with one another, and it made us rethink completely the idea of the roof, which was an ordeal to actually bring the timber. We wanted to try the timber, but it came from Russia through the Lars Pass, which is often full of landslides, and then there's obvious political tensions between Georgia and Russia, which stopped the whole material. And basically it was a nightmare. And then when the wood is there, the problem is the know-how and the craft, which somehow doesn't match the wood. Whereas the know-how and the craft in terms of stone is amazing. So we are now going back to previous iterations of the roof, which at the time seemed a bit ludicrous to us, which was to kind of work with stone and recreate the beams out of stone, and it somehow taps more into that history of the glkhatun, which have their dome and the geometry and the volume of their dome modified in terms of the region where they were built. So, for example, long spans domes, more simple one, were closer to forest region, whereas the more intricate one was from the mountainous region because you had small pieces of wood. So it's really about these two material and somehow find tectonic language that permeate between the stone and the concrete textile or geotextile, and somehow try to approach a form of architecture that reveal rather than impose, and that speaks of a form of architecture of attunement. And that's your caravanserai. And yeah, so it's first and foremost a collective endeavor. It's a big team. Maria is also here. She's been drawing quite a lot. And so we welcome anyone who would be interested in engaging some of the project or just would want to kind of come and excavate for one summer. So, or build, who knows. So thank you. Oh, I didn't press my microphone. Is it this one?
Good evening, everyone. I'll try to be shorter so we have time to discuss all together afterwards. So I'm Nairi Khatchadourian. I was born and raised in Paris, and I live in Armenia since 2015. So it's 10 years that I enjoy really working in Armenia. So thank you, Aram and Shant, for inviting non-architects and at AA. So I'll bring some curatorial perspective to the built environment in Armenia and beyond its borders. Here we can see a beautiful photo from the Cascade complex, which is kind of the main cultural and urban destination in the capital, in Yerevan. It was built during the Soviet era, but today it's converted into a contemporary art museum. And you see a work that we produced with AHA Collective during an exhibition that I'll talk to you about. When I moved to Armenia, I started working in public museums at the Komitas Museum Institute. And I very quickly understood that the artistic community in Yerevan and also in the regions is not very much engaged in the museum and institutional platforms. That was 10 years ago. Today it has changed, fortunately. And that's why I created AHA Collective, which is a curatorial practice that I founded in 2019 in Yerevan. And our aim is really to work with the collective and act for the collective. We conceive different projects, artistic and research projects, in a way so they foster collaboration between different practitioners, in a way so they investigate the local resources that we have and the local know-how, and become a subject of conversation of the society of today and tomorrow. We manage, curate, and commission different research work, artworks, exhibition, publications, and also site-specific installations in urban or rural contexts. I don't know if it's my diasporic background, but I really like working with tangible and intangible cultural heritage. So really like the artifacts, materials, architectures, different heritage that we have today in Armenia, and the ones that are either in contemporary Turkey or in today's Azerbaijan. So different territories, communities, and public institutions. And we implement each project with a multidisciplinary approach and connect different fields of expertise. So there are a number of architects with whom I've been working, among which Shant, Charoian, for different exhibition and research projects, but also anthropologists, and Zovinar Kuyumchan is here from Oxford, who's been also part of one of the projects that I'll be talking about. And after 5 years of work, now in Yerevan, there is a small gallery and a project space that I opened. So your next destination in Yerevan, you know where to come. And by the way, it's a beautiful apartment on the second floor of a building designed by Georg Tamanyan. So we actually all connect in very, very different ways. So I'll be just very quickly do an overview of 3 of the main projects that I've been working on in the past 5 years. All of them have in common that they address the contemporary geopolitical context of Armenia, and they try to offer some places of reflection and dialogue about the extremely fragile and tense situation that Armenia is going through since the past 5 years. So Hanging Garden, Dadivank and Beyond is a project that started within a very specific architectural setting, which is the Dadivank Monastery in Artsakh. Artsakh is the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, and then became an exhibition project at the Caucasian Center for the Arts that you just saw in the photo. Then the Living Portals multidisciplinary project, again, was done through fieldwork within a very specific region in Armenia, in the south, and turned into an exhibition project. And point of reference is actually a very interesting outcome of this Living Portals exhibition that goes beyond actual museum walls and become part of a very important part of any film festival, which is the red carpet. So as you will see in all the projects, we try through our artistic practice to respond to some of those questions that we are facing as both Armenians living in the diaspora, but also in Armenia. How can contemporary art engage with the deep layered histories of a place, including the communities, heritage, and landscapes that have been silenced, erased, or at the risk of being destroyed? How can curatorial projects transform suppressed heritage into living resources, allowing contemporary communities to generate new, inclusive narratives and reclaim their connection to their lost or absent places? And in regions marked by political denial, appropriation, and genocide, how can we foster a dialogue through art that challenges state-sponsored, dominant, and rewritten narratives, and redefine the meaning of heritage in a way that leads to new forms of placemaking? And after 5 years, when I'm kind of reviewing the works that we've produced with Aha Collective, I really think that I'm trying to connect art with placemaking, and maybe it's an interesting topic to then discuss all together. So this is the first project I wanted to talk to you about. It's called Hanging Garden, Dadivank and Beyond. So a map to situate ourselves. We see the borders of contemporary Armenia, with the territory of Artsakh before the 44 Days War in 2020, launched by Azerbaijan, and after the 44 Days War in 2020. We see in blue, I hope, here the location of the Dadivank Monastery before and after. So you see that this heritage site is now under control of Azerbaijan. And you start to think what will happen with the architecture of the place and the history. We are in a context of war, and as cultural practitioners, we think that we should act in our own way. And I came across Agamben's publication that he wrote during COVID, and this quote kind of reflects how we acted during this very fragile context. So nothing I'm doing makes any sense if the house is on fire. Yet even when the house is on fire, it is necessary to continue as before, to do everything with care and precision, perhaps even more so than before, even if no one notices. This is the beautiful Dadivank monastery that was built from the 9th century to the 13th, 14th century. It's perched on a beautiful hill in the mountain chain of Artsakh, so that's why it was called Hanging Garden. The status of this monastery became questionable after the 44 Days War because it was under the authorities of Azerbaijan, but with Russian so-called peacekeepers present on the site for 5 years. And actually the local community before the war, being Armenian priests, they also were inside the complex. So imagine the layers of communities that don't speak with each other at all and that don't relate and belong to this architectural masterpiece. After the 44 Days War, this region in Artsakh had to be evacuated. So imagine the region of, I don't know, like Oxford being evacuated during war. And lots of Armenians from Armenia, but also from diaspora, were wanting to go and see the monastery. So a kind of improvised pilgrimage took place on November 13th, 2020. And even when this travel was being organized in Yerevan, different people were calling whoever was willing to go and asking even like questions like, what should I wear? So I had received a call from a stranger because I had a car and we were going to go. Should I wear a suit, a tie? Like, what do you answer? And with my artist colleagues, Maida Shavak, a French Armenian who was in Armenia, present here during the war, Anush Ghukasyan and Vahram Galsyan, we gathered and we thought that we could go, be present that day within that monastic complex, but do something and inscribe the architectural heritage on some documents. During such war periods, you don't think conceptually, and what I suggested to the artist, and I'm a curator, not an artist, but I guess during such war periods, everything changes, that maybe we could just take papers and clay, because Anush Ghukasyan and Vahram Galsyan are ceramist artists, and create imprints from the different inscriptions and ornaments of the monastery. So we went to Dadivank very early in the morning because we knew that so many people were going to come, and we just wanted to create the imprints in not a crowded environment. And we produced different varied sizes of imprints in clay and paper. And as you can see, we have both like the different geometrical and floral patterns and decor, but also the inscriptions. And I mean, you also saw in Aram and Shant's presentation all the architectural heritage that we have in Armenia, the religious architectural heritage. They're full of inscriptions, and that's also a target from Azerbaijan when for centuries they've been destroying, like in Nakhichevan, many cultural heritage, and especially the ones who have inscriptions. So when we're producing those, we didn't think at all, I didn't think at all of doing an exhibition, a publication, public programming around this topic. We just wanted to inscribe this heritage on something tangible And even the title of these pieces is actually the geolocalization of the monastery, because that's a data that can't be erased. A year and a half later, the Kafesjan Center for the Arts asked me to curate an exhibition because they had seen the work that we produced. So within museum walls, we tried to recreate the spatial nature of the Dadivang monastery, and we hang the different paper imprints and clay imprints in a way so people can move in between the pieces and feel as if they are inside this monastic complex. It's very interesting because the paper and the clay imprints created the negative and positive image of the wall of the monastery, so we had different readings of the architecture. I also commissioned different works related to our context to the artist, and Anush Rukasyan produced this sculptural installation, What Does It Mean to Be a Soldier, and Vahram Galsyan produced a beautiful video art series on collapse. But when we were working on the exhibition, we also understood that during the war, many cultural cultural demonstrations were happening in London, in Paris, and everywhere, and the flags were used, like flags are used to express belonging with a soccer team or a country. And with Maida Shabak, the artist, we really wanted to reflect on how can we talk about our belonging with the territory of Artsakh through flags, but with a new content. And during the war, a photographer from Artsakh and also poet had produced different verses that were extremely powerful that we printed on the flags and produced a film, which you can look in AHA Collective's website. And this also became a tool to work with the public on this aspect of how to express your belonging with a territory, an architectural heritage, and we produced stamps, like wooden stamps for different families and children to create poetry and express their belonging through this collective poem that was read at the closing of the exhibition. The war didn't stop, and it got worse. So the region of Artsakh got in a total blockade by Azerbaijan. So you can see in red the Berzor corridor that was blocked by Azerbaijan for more than 10 months. And during that time, a project was born that we conducted in this southern region. So, where is this? Do you see? Okay, yeah, this southern region where Goris is like the hub and where it connects with the corridor and it goes towards the region of Artsakh. And we started a project with different practitioners, so artists, photographer, architects, and anthropologists, to kind of research this region, which is rich in terms of architectural heritage and a very specific heritage in architecture, which are the caves. And we started thinking about how we animate what we inherited from a territory. What are the intimate relationships that we build when we collaborate with a specific place and its community, its people? How does a habitat change due to geopolitical circumstances? And what holds at the end of the day together in a common place? Shant talked about this house of culture phenomenon during the Soviet era, where each village had like a house of culture. Fortunately, the one in Oshakan, designed by Guillaume Othenin-Girard, is still active and open. But the majority of the house of cultures are closed and abandoned after the collapse of the USSR. And it's the case of this one in the village of Verishen, so in the southern region of Syunik in Armenia. And this is the site, one of the sites we worked with. And through a 1-year field work and creative kind of residency in this region, in 2023, the House of Culture reopened. So this is just one of the examples of how really art and this placemaking notion is really linked, and how by doing field work within a region and exhibiting and engaging with the local community, such sites have the power of just reopen and be again living resources for the local community. So it's a beautiful exhibition that we opened with many artists working with different mediums. And next to this Soviet era heritage, we had one of the most gorgeous church in Armenia, a 5th century basilic church, St. Hripsime Church, that was again not used and not operating as a church, beside like the local community coming and burning candles, but there were no rituals taking place inside the church. And the exhibition also became a medium to revive this beautiful heritage and actually give back one of the material heritage of a church, which is the carpet inside the space. So as I said, this region is very specific for its architectural heritage because it has many cave villages. So on the left, we see a beautiful photo from Piruza Khalapian, and it's a view from the inside of the cave. Khanzoresk, and it's now old Khanzoresk because we have the new Khanzoresk that was built during the Soviet era, is the major center for weaving, carpet weaving. It was until the 20th century. And there are many Armenian historical carpets that actually bear the name of Khanzoresk, like the village name, that are today like traded all over in auction houses in Europe and elsewhere. And on the right, you see a beautiful contemporary carpet that is called Bold Khanzoresk, that was designed by David Kochuns. And it's with the work of David Kochuns that this project started, but then grew because many artists and researchers were working inside this region, and the project became just like an opportunity for everyone to come together and to reflect on the architectural heritage, but also the carpet weaving heritage. The region of Syunik and Artsakh, which are geographically extremely mountainous, have this heritage of carpet making, and although the heritage is huge and all the historical pieces are not only kept within public museums in Armenia, but especially in many private collections in Europe and the US, today this craft is in the verge of not disappearing, but becoming something that is not used by contemporary artists. And the project that we started with David Kochuns, and afterwards it grew, really takes at the center the craft of carpet making. On the left, we see a beautiful archival photograph from Guros, a local photographer who had documented the region with different anthropologists. And on the right, you see this same village of Khanzoresk today. So as you can see, the natural environment took over, and all the houses today don't exist because during the Soviet era in the 1960s, the Soviet leaders said, we are living in a modern period, who lives in caves? So they forced the inhabitants to leave their village and relocate in the upper plateau, and that's when they built the new Khanzoresk village. And the territory of this cave village became just a natural cave environment. This is the creative process of creating this contemporary carpet collection. So we can see on the left the sketch that was produced by David Koçuns. He translated this cave architectural heritage in the design of carpets, and then 9 pieces were produced by a local workshop in Verishen village. And this local workshop was inside the House of Culture that was abandoned for 35 years. And it's actually the director of this workshop who suggested that all this research and fieldwork that we're producing, we should exhibit it inside this House of Culture so that we reopen it for the local community. Those are beautiful photographs from Piruza Khalapian, just documenting the outcome of the creative process. And it's interesting how something that we produced within like this bordering villages during a very fragile geopolitical context gave birth to something nationwide, which is the Golden Apricot International Film Festival that is taking place every summer in Yerevan. And after all the research, the publication and exhibition that we produced, the art director of the film festival invited us and suggested that we rethink what a red carpet is today. This invitation came again in an extremely difficult geopolitical context like last year, because we are in September 2023, when Azerbaijan launches a large-scale and extremely rapid war on Artsakh and forces the entire Armenian population of Artsakh to be forcibly displaced in Armenia. So as I was helping the population in the south during this ethnic cleansing, David Koçuns was giving educational workshops to communities, and we started thinking, red carpet today, what does it mean if we have to rethink it? How can we involve the vulnerable communities that is being just displaced? And why the Artsakh community? Because as I said, the carpet making craft is something extremely rich in that region. And although the communities are trying to settle in different cities and villages in Armenia, providing employment is also something that will help them build their new lives in Armenia. So I got in touch again with the different craft workshops and host communities where weavers from Artsakh were also being engaged. And we started weaving this new red carpet. David Koçuns, the artist, has a very special connection with the territory of Artsakh because he did his military service there and also served as an artillery soldier in Artsakh during 2020, during the war. So his perspective on that region and the heritage that is today under risk of total destruction by Azerbaijan was actually through maps. As a soldier, you have specific maps, of course, not the Google Maps that we all use. But during this situation, when he was thinking how to design a red carpet, what to produce in terms of content on the kind of the road where people are going to walk, right? He reflected on our context and translated different maps of cities and villages of Artsakh into design motif. And here what you're seeing, those are actually 6 different cities and villages that he mapped out and highlighted different aspects of the architectural heritage and urban and rural heritage of the given territories. Those are just photos during the installation process of the red carpet. The opening took place in one of the biggest cultural venue in Yerevan, which is the Garen Demirjan complex. And the team of the Golden Apricot Film Festival gave us the outdoor space in order to install the red carpet. In total, there were 7 unique pieces of 2 on 3, and we decided to place them with a bit of distance between one another in order for people, in order to understand what will be the reaction of people. Would they walk on it? Would they just look or not look and pass through? Of course, I wanted everyone to be barefoot. If we're thinking of the red carpet and we want this glamour aspect to go out then and to concentrate again on the artistic, right? Then we should be barefoot, and because it's the kind of the territory of Artsakh that we just lost, it's also a matter of being equal on the land. And of course, it was too avant-garde for the local community, so I just took out my shoes when installing, but the opening, everyone walked on it. Here you can see some key figures from the cinema world. Adam Egoyan, an Armenian-Canadian actor, but also Alexander Payne, the American director, who was the the president of the jury of this year. And we produced a small film that I'd like to just show you before closing my talk, in order for you to see all the people that were involved, the artists, but also the craft makers, and how it actually looked, all the pieces together. Because we were going to walk on it, we really wanted this aerial perspective on the territory, and this is David Konchuns, the artist. Mariam is the one who did the natural dyeing and all the weavers.
Thank you very much. Oh, is it working? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, both of you. I think it might be, there are so many themes that were coming up that I think tie all of our different kinds of projects together in terms of like the importance of mapping and documentation. Also, I thought it was quite interesting how the idea of threats and crisis and creative production, whether it's the threat of overdevelopment or whether it's the threat of territorial disputes, and, or the threat of industrialization of natural areas. I remember when when I visited your site, Guillaume, you could see was it a cement factory that was expanding into the kind of territory, this archaeological territory. So obviously there's a lot of change happening. So yeah, I thought it was very interesting to see. I hope you all enjoyed it. I think because of time, maybe perhaps we can open up to some questions right away and let that generate a conversation. Does Does that sound like a good idea? Does anybody have any questions? No? Ah, there's one.
While other people are thinking of questions, I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of the Armenian Institute for the incredible work that all of you are doing. It's so touching, and to me, this is a response to the threat to Armenia and a response of survival, how we can survive. And since we are outside of Armenia and we're in the diaspora, my question really is, what can we do from the outside to support what you're doing and to make this work known? But are there other avenues that we could take and support this work? Thank you very much indeed.
Well, I think the Oshakan project is a brilliant example of how the diaspora can be involved, but also the institutional resources that exist in each country. As a French Armenian, when I started working in Yerevan, for me it was very important to work in the public field, so that's why the Komitas Museum. And although I founded AHA Collective, which is an independent, alternative kind of curatorial platform, I still continue working with different institutions and public museums. And to me, like what the diaspora and international institutions could do is really strengthen Armenia from an institutional perspective. So either it's capacity building efforts that international experts from different institutions can come and do with local experts, or it's really like institutional efforts that are strengthened, and especially beyond Yerevan, so more in the regional context. And so Oshakan or the Vedi project Guillaume is doing, or what we're doing with AHA in different regions of Armenia, is something that should be double, tripled through your support.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts about the diaspora, actually. Maybe it's because I'm an Armenian diasporan who doesn't speak Armenian and particularly aware of it. But there is a certain hesitancy that I at least have as an architect traveling to Armenia, engaging with it, trying to create projects, because one does feel, to what extent am I as a diasporan being opportunistic in this place? To what extent am I trying to impose a certain set of experiences and understandings of how the world ought to work on a place that is different? And I think what's interesting is that there is this drive to sort of participate and be entrepreneurial and come up with ideas and propose alternatives and suggest things, and which I think we're all doing. But then I think something else that you see is a kind of insistence on engaging, whether it be mapping or community workshops or bringing in, pairing people who live there, who are Eastern Armenians or whatever you want to, whichever terminology you want to use with diasporans. And so I think there is definitely, across all of the projects, a certain sensitivity and awareness of that relationship between the diaspora and the kind of local country, which I think is interesting. And I think that coming up with ideas and proposals is a good place to start.
Yeah, basically like looking at what your interests are, maybe, and then figuring out how you can get creative with it, because here we're talking about culture, right? And maybe Aram and me and Nairi are like good examples of people who are from the diaspora to some degree, and find ways of what we're interested in, and then finding ways implementing that in Armenia. And maybe the most exciting thing for you, I don't know what your interests are, but maybe the most exciting thing for you is maybe think about what your interests are and what you do in the UK and how you could work with that, and maybe bring that to Armenia, because like Aram's a good example of his AA connections and how we got the AA visiting school.
It's also, there's a certain kind of creative energy that happens organically when, I mean, one thing I found so fascinating about Yerevan when I went there for the first time was that you really read the conflict across the whole of the Middle East in Yerevan. You have, Shant is from Syria, you have, restaurants run by Lebanese, you have, people from all over. You have Yazidis who've fled there from Iraq. So you feel that energy, and there's that mixing. So on the one hand, it's very, very Armenian, but on the other hand, it's actually quite international. And I think that it's having a particularly interesting effect in terms of generating interactions and generating ideas out of those interactions. So I think that's, So out of this crisis, perhaps there are always blossomings of ideas.
I think Guillaume's case is very interesting because he's not Armenian, as you can see physically, but as like an architect who teaches in Hong Kong but practices in Armenia with the local communities beyond the capital, so in the region, with like other practitioners who are like archaeologists, who researchers also the vernacular architecture, which is really like a heritage that is slowly being under the radar. Like for years, it's more the modernist Soviet era architecture, which has been researched a lot by researchers, both Armenians and foreigners. So Guillaume's interest towards Armenia is interesting to explore and see if it could inspire you.
You're up.
Yes, so I'm not Armenian, but no, I think my encounter with Armenia was, it's a little bit of a serendipity, because I arrived in Hong Kong at the very beginning of my tenure track there, and I met an archaeologist who was starting to excavate the Vedi fortress, and he knew the work I was doing with archaeology before, and he's like, just come have a look. And I was like, yeah. And so, and my first visit, I was very much taken by the place, by its geography, its complexity, but also first and foremost the people. And what you were describing about Yerevan, I very much feel as well. I was very moved, essentially, by the energy that was going on, and completely hooked also by the landscape. And then started to kind of dwell in, kind of having a crash course on Armenian history and contemporary tangibilities. And yes, then I also fell in love with the glkhatun, actually. And then things started to unfold like that. But in terms of help, such events like that is already immensely helpful to be able to disseminate the work and to also, I've never seen your presentation, neither yours, and also to kind of create these bridges are very important. And in terms of what we're trying to convey is, because we create all these datas and then we create mapping in one way is an archival material, an archival process, understanding these traces and how they are related. But we very much think about it as a propositional tool to enact, essentially, in the place. And that's what we talk about in terms of like proto-projects. And I think that's exactly what you're also tending towards, and that's exactly what you're actually doing. And so these initiatives, at the end of the day, come with people's interest and own desire, in terms of, if it's about irrigation, agriculture, agroarchaeology, carpet and weaving techniques, and basically to literally dive in.
I think it's interesting if you think historically about Armenian trade networks, where you have Persian Armenians setting up shop in Amsterdam or India in order to trade silk and textiles, or Hong Kong. You have monasteries in Venice with printing presses sending out texts to the different monasteries around the globe in order to get translations produced fairly early on in the 17th century. And I think that has historically always proved to be quite an interesting advantage, this kind of ability to try to share information across these networks and develop knowledge. I mean, if I think, the competition I mentioned in Gyumri that we won, in a way it's in terms of creating opportunities and bringing knowledge. I mean, we're working with Webb Yates, brilliant structural engineers who specialize in structural stone here in London, and bringing them to Armenia, and hopefully we can create kind of exchange where Webb Yates are excited because they get to learn from Armenia, and hopefully there's something that gets to be generated there locally as well. So there's always something productive about this, different exchanges. Can we do one more question, Eric?
I was going to ask a three-part question, but I won't. Okay. Just a two-part question then. Firstly, what was the feedback from the students with the Oshakan project? I mean, did they have the most amazing time? And did you find that bringing the concept of heritage, but focusing on heritage within Oshakan as an example, that the locals took it on? Were they kind of very much aware of it, or are they thinking, we want to build lots of private swimming pools in our space, or do we want to preserve these beautiful engravings on these beautiful buildings?
Well, for the first part of that question, maybe some of the students can answer that question. Because what did you think about? I can see at least 5 of you.
Yes, more than 5.
I can single that one out. I would say it's a school that we all want to go back to and return to, which is pretty important if it's going to continue. Like they said, it was a year we all had to try and understand the place we've never been to. We loved it. Yeah, I want to go back.
I think the time aspect, it being a multi-year project, was really important. That we wanted to start small and then see how it evolved over time. And you have to build up trust with that community, and that takes time. So this was just the beginning of that process. So we just have to see what comes out of it. I think going in without having a blueprint already in your mind of what you're doing is very important.
And I think in regard to the students, actually, one interesting aspect was, I think we got maybe 6, 7 participants come up and ask, why are we here? I don't understand what we're doing here. Because I think Oshakan is one of those villages that maybe you don't see the beauty of until maybe you spend some time and kind of discover it on your own. And I think that was the same experience among me and Aram as well. Because it takes time to understand all the layers, and I think by the end of it, everyone kind of found their own interests within the village, which was really, really exciting.
And I'm getting glared at, so there's a whole set of drinks, I believe, in the bar waiting for everybody, and we've got the exhibition of our photographs. So thank you very much, everybody.